Oh man, this is an interesting matchup. What's good? It's Woog. We've got Gervonta Tank Davis, 29 wins and 0 losses, and 27 of those wins have come via knockout, is defending his WBA lightweight title against Frank Martin, 18 wins and 0 losses. As I said, I find this matchup to be very interesting, and Ryan Garcia fight aside, this is probably the first time in several years that I've been excited about a Gervonta Davis matchup. And that's not to say that he hasn't fought good fighters. I'm just saying that on paper, when a Gervonta Davis fight has been announced, it is almost never against somebody who you would have chosen as one of your top 3 to top 5 opponents for Tank Davis. And in a lot of those Tank Davis matchups, there's always some caveat, like Hector Garcia had recently won a 130-pound title that he has since lost to Lamont Roach. But when Tank versus Hector Garcia, before the Ryan Garcia fight was announced, it was Hector Garcia, the then 130-pound belt holder, going up to 135 to fight Tank Davis. And then with Rolly Romero, like nobody even really wanted that matchup. In fact, they were trying to make that matchup sooner, but then Rolly Romero at the time had a legal issue that pulled him out of the fight. Isaac Cruz was a late replacement. Now, Isaac Cruz is a fight and a win that has aged very well for Tank Davis. Like, you know, Isaac Cruz is a pretty good fighter, but at the time, Isaac Cruz was, you know, beating like the Francisco Vargas level fighters, but he wasn't a world beater at the time. Nobody looked at him as being like a top 5 lightweight, but his reputation, Isaac Cruz's reputation, grew with that close, somewhat disputed decision loss against Tank Davis. But at the time that Isaac Cruz was a late replacement for Rolly Romero, that wasn't a matchup that people were super excited about. And right before that, Mario Barrios, another win that I feel is aging well. But Mario Barrios, it turns out, was probably too big for the 140-pound division. He's now doing pretty well at 147, but Gervonta Davis was much smaller than Barrios, but there are a lot of people who would argue that Mario Barrios had diminished performance ability due to, you know, a difficult weight cut and being 5'11", still trying to shrink down to 140. But it was still Gervonta Davis going up to 140 to fight Barrios, who had been competing in that division. So I actually look at that fight and that win as being very meaningful and one of Gervonta Davis's like maybe 3 to 4 best wins. And that fight, like the fight against Isaac Cruz, involved Gervonta Davis having to struggle a bit to get that win. Now, he stopped Mario Barrios in the late rounds, but like halfway into that fight, Floyd Mayweather had to go up to Gervonta Davis and warn him that he was down on the unofficial scorecards at the time. So that was a fight that involved a lot of close rounds and resistance. And that's another thing that we're going to get into. The fact that a lot of Tank Davis fights involve Tank Davis losing multiple rounds, like even against Hector Garcia, against Rolando Romero, obviously against Isaac Cruz, where Tank Davis visibly, observably hurt his left hand and barely used that hand, his signature left hand, in the second half of the fight. But, you know, he dropped a few rounds against Mario Barrios. Even before that, against Leo Santa Cruz, in a fight where, here's another caveat, it was Santa Cruz competing in a division where he had only fought once and wasn't known to be a fighter in that division. So it still felt like Santa Cruz was going up and fighting a bigger, younger Tank Davis. And yes, it is a name that's very meaningful, a potential future Hall of Famer, Leo Santa Cruz, but context matters, and I feel like we get this in a lot of different Tank Davis fights. Before that, Yuriorkis Gamboa was like in his late 30s. And even in Tank's most recent fight against Ryan Garcia, there was the famous rehydration clause that Ryan Garcia signed to, agreed to, but had to endure. And I don't know, that just takes away from the intrigue and the excitement of a fight when you feel like one guy might be more compromised than the other. So this Tank Davis versus Frank Martin matchup feels like the freshest, most on the up and up matchup that we've gotten, you know, maybe since the Isaac Cruz fight, in terms of the quality of opponent. And Frank Martin right now has a bigger reputation and is more highly rated, highly ranked, highly touted than Isaac Cruz was at the time of Tank versus Pitbull. But again, this Pitbull win is aging well, but you would have to go all the way back to Tank Davis's like 130 days, maybe against like Liam Walsh or Jose Pedraza, something like that in terms of a fresh matchup against a quality fighter where there are no caveats like catch weights or rehydration clauses, although it was looking like there was about to be a rehydration clause, but the WBA removed what was going to be, I believe, a 12-pound rehydration clause. So at least that is out of the way. So we are truly getting Tank Davis versus Frank Martin. And right now, I think that a lot of people are looking at this fight as being like a setup fight. If Tank Davis can pass this test, I think it's going to be a tough test. But if he passes this, given Lomachenko's recent performance over George Kambosos, I feel like now would be the time to do Tank Davis, to finally do Tank Davis versus Vasily Lomachenko. Because again, when it comes to Tank Davis matchups, you know, he hasn't fought Devin Haney. He hasn't fought Shakur Stevenson, but more meaningfully and more importantly, given what Lomachenko has meant to the division in around 130, 135, and how long we've been wanting to see Lomachenko versus Tank Davis, I feel like that is the fight for Tank Davis that has to happen. I mean, Haney is up at 140 right now, so I don't think that we're going to get Tank versus Haney anytime soon. And I kind of feel like Tank Davis is maxed out physically at 135 in terms of where he should be fighting and where you're going to get the best of him. Yes, he has beaten, again, Mario Barrios at 140, but I don't think that Tank Davis is going to be fighting the cream of the crop at 140. He might just do one-offs here and there, but he, like Lomachenko, I feel physically tops out at 135. So Tank versus Frank Martin. On one hand, you've got Gervonta Davis, who, if you don't have him in your top 10 pound for pound, it's because he hasn't fought enough of the opponents that matter. But in terms of his fight by fight performances and the physical attributes and what you see him bringing to the table, fight over fight over fight, he is without a doubt a top 10, I would say top 6 to top 8 talent at the very least. Like, if he fights these other guys and he does well, I mean, he is, to me, a top 3 to 5 potential guy. I mean, he's been pretty extraordinary. Again, 27 out of his 29 wins have come via knockout. And, you know, you start lining up some of these names. Ryan Garcia knocked him out. Hector Garcia stopped him. Raleigh Romero beat Isaac Cruz. Mario Barrios stopped him. Santa Cruz put his lights out. Knockout of the year style knockout. Gamboa, Pedraza. He is actually lining up a pretty nice resume. Again, at the time that a lot of these fights, most of these fights are made, we're not excited about them, but it's not like they are not quality guys for the most part. But in terms of his physical attributes, his hand speed, his reflexes, his defense even, which I feel is kind of underrated. Yes, in certain fights, he will take one to give two, or in some cases take two to give one, like against Hector Garcia in a fight where Tank Davis took a lot of punches, in contrast to the way Tank Davis was fighting Raleigh Romero. He gave Romero, because of Romero's punching power, a lot more respect than he was giving Hector Garcia. But just skill for skill, Gervonta Davis is the total package. Even if you look at the way that he was ducking those first round Ryan Garcia left hooks, where Ryan Garcia was coming in kind of head over skis and the hooks were just whizzing over Gervonta Davis's head. He was very slippery and very reflex based in letting Ryan Garcia empty out his arsenal and waiting for the perfect opportunity to counter with that beautiful left hand. Gervonta Davis is very skillful. Yes, he does have the reputation of being a devastating power puncher, but he is an excellent boxer. And I feel like that gets lost in some of these conversations. Like when people hypothetically say, oh, Shakur Stevenson would beat Gervonta Davis, or Devin Haney, even, you know, I'm saying before Devin Haney lost to Ryan Garcia in a fight that might get overturned decision-wise, results-wise. But people were suggesting that because of the sweet style acumen of Shakur Stevenson or Devin Haney or Lomachenko, that these guys would have a good shot at beating Gervonta Davis. I'm thinking not so fast. With Gervonta Davis, you better not make a mistake. You know, unlike fighting guys like Loma, Haney, Shakur Stevenson, where they're not going to put you out in most cases with one or even a few shots. With Gervonta Davis, your margin for error is super slim. Sometimes you don't get a second chance. Like if you mess up and leave an opening, that could be all she wrote. And Gervonta Davis has shown us that time and time again. So personally, I would like Gervonta Davis's chances against any of those guys, but I would still love to see the fights. Against Frank Martin, he's fighting an undefeated fighter with a lot of momentum who's beaten some pretty decent fighters. Like he stopped Romero Duno. And I know that stopping Romero Duno in 2022 is when he did it isn't the same as like when Ryan Garcia did it a couple years prior. He stopped Jackson Mariñez, who should have had a decision win against Rolly Romero, but Frank Martin stopped Jackson Mariñez. But I think it was his next fight that I consider to be the best performance thus far in Frank Martin's career. And it was a pretty one-sided unanimous decision win against Michel Rivera, who tested positive for PEDs afterwards. But Michel Rivera, the guy who kind of looks like Ali, kind of stands like Ali, has the Ali haircut, the Ali trunks, and Michel Rivera has since beaten Sergey Lipinets. But Frank Martin's performance in that fight, how elusive he was, how much he kind of dictated the pace, how much he was backing Michel Rivera up. He dropped Michel Rivera in that fight. Frank Martin never looked better. And Frank Martin is a very skillful southpaw who changes levels really well. He goes to the body really well. So Frank Martin was shining in that fight, but his next fight against Artem Harutyunyan, who's actually going to be Shakur Stevenson's next opponent, that didn't go so well. Yes, Frank Martin won the fight, but like through 8 to 10 rounds on the unofficial scorecard, I think it was Al Bernstein, he had Harutyunyan up by like 3 to 4 points, where I think Bernstein ended up, even after the 12th round knockdown, I think Bernstein had Harutyunyan winning the fight, but they gave the decision to Frank Martin. And it was very important that he got that 12th round knockdown in the final minute of the fight. Like Harutyunyan took a knee in the final minute. It was pretty dramatic. And again, Frank Martin had to really rally back. He lost a couple of the early rounds. It looked like he was losing most of the middle rounds. I looked at that fight like it really could have gone either way. They were going to each other's body, but Harutyunyan was able to kind of jump into the pocket, throw a couple nice shots at a time on Frank Martin. Some of those were getting through, and he was kind of outworking Frank Martin, just doing more, throwing more combinations. Yes, Frank Martin would often come back and explode with like 2 punches at a time, but Artem Harutyunyan was looking pretty good there, and Frank Martin was looking a lot more beatable than we had seen him look in his prior fights. And that's Frank Martin's most recent fight. So he's not coming off of a spectacular performance, and they were about to make Shakur Stevenson versus Frank Martin. Frank Martin pulled out of that fight. He got a lot of blowback on that one too. It kind of looked at the time like Frank Martin was ducking Shakur Stevenson. But, you know, in fairness, if he did know that he had this opportunity against a bigger money fighter, Tank Davis, lined up, or there was a high probability that he would get this fight, you could understand why he would opt not to fight Shakur Stevenson and instead fight Tank Davis. I thought at the time that maybe he had an easier path to kind of backdoor his way into a then vacant lightweight title, one of the 4 titles that Haney would have vacated, right? We just saw Lomachenko win one of those. We just saw Dennis Berinchyk upset Navarrete for one of those belts. And we know that Shakur Stevenson's got one of those belts, and Gervonta Davis has the WBA title. So no, fighting Tank Davis for the WBA belt isn't backing your way into a title. Like, it's fighting one of the most dangerous opponents in all of boxing. But I'm really looking at how these styles match up. This is interesting because it's southpaw versus southpaw. Frank Martin is about 5'7" to 5'8". Tank Davis is listed as about 5'5". So Tank Davis is used to being the shorter fighter. And I mean, the only time I could think of offhand that he wasn't the shorter fighter in recent years was against Pitbull Cruz. But analyzing these guys' styles, I wouldn't be surprised if this is a relatively low action fight. Like, Gervonta Davis, again, he will be willing to drop a few rounds to get to you, basically. Like, he will fight a patient style where he kind of backs up, or he'll either slowly pursue being a patient hunter, or he'll just take a step back, Frank Martin, I would imagine, should be controlling some of the more slow portions of the round. Like, if Gervonta Davis isn't coming in and exploding with combinations, you would think that it's going to be Frank Martin either with a jab or with a jab to the body, just doing little things to seem like he's busier, to seem like he's showing, good ring generalship. But I don't see Frank Martin being able to drop that level, go to the body to Tank Davis in the same way that he was against Harutunian and other opponents. I mean, again, the margin for error is so thin. And when you go to the body in the way that Frank Martin often does, you're committing in a way where I don't know if you will have the comfort level of being able to let your hands go like that against somebody like Tank Davis. So I don't think that Frank Martin is going to be able to control rounds like he was against Michel Rivera. Again, the threat level is just so much different here. But I know that he's got to be preparing very well. Like, he's an Errol Spence fighter. He works with Derek James. So he's very well schooled. And it's not like he's a early 20s fighter. He's in his late 20s, like Tank Davis. I mean, both of these guys are 29 years old. And another thing that's interesting when you look at the measurables is that because Frank Martin is around 3 inches taller, we're talking 5'5" against 5'8", you would think that Frank Martin would have a longer jab, but it's not significantly longer, at least in terms of the measurables. We're talking 67.5 inches for Tank Davis versus 68 inches. So it's only a ½ inch difference in reach. So when Frank Martin is making his move, he's going to be in range to get hit by Tank as well. And although Frank is usually pretty good at having a hand up, like he'll usually pick off the hooks that are coming his way, when you change levels and go to the body, that's just a different level of exposure, especially when you're fighting a shorter fighter because, Harutunian was a little taller than Frank Martin. Not only that, but Tank Davis hides his body pretty well. Being a shorter fighter, he kind of has a stance where it's not easy to get inside and then to go to Tank's body again without leaving yourself super exposed. So what normally works for Frank Martin in going to the body, I don't know if that's going to be an option here. So then what do you have? You've got the jab, you've got your own left hand, you've got your right hook. But I just look at Tank as being a lot more sudden, like when you could just fire off a shot with no setup, no wind up, you just boom, throw the punch. I look at Tank Davis as being more blessed in that than Frank Martin. Not that Frank Martin is slow. I just think that Tank Davis, when he explodes, has more snappiness to his movements. But you would think that for Frank Martin, that going to the body has to be at least a part of the recipe here. But I do think that in lieu of going to the body repeatedly, I think that the jab is going to work well for Frank Martin. I think that the parts of the round that he does control, they're going to be patient and they're going to involve a lot of jabs. I'm just wondering who between these two guys is going to be coming forward and who's going to be looking to take a step back in the counter, because at their cores, they're both counter punchers. So I actually think that it might be Gervonta Davis who starts walking Frank Martin down. I wouldn't be surprised if that process doesn't start sooner rather than later. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Tank starts walking Frank down by like the 4th or 5th round. And once Tank gets a punch in there that hurts Frank Martin, it's tough to imagine that Frank Martin will then win rounds after that. Like, usually when things start going bad for Tank Davis opponents, they start unraveling quickly. But I do think that Frank Martin is pretty durable. I mean, we haven't seen him against punchers anywhere near Tank Davis's level. When I was coming into this video, I was actually going to go Tank Davis via decision. And I was going to say that it was going to be a fight that doesn't involve a ton of fireworks, because both guys are going to be cautious. Both guys are going to be patient. But I think that just because of the way that they fight, the way that Frank Martin is going to feel the need to answer when Tank Davis gets off, or that Tank Davis, if Frank Martin wants to have success either up top or to the body, Tank Davis will be very reactive to that. Frank Martin, in order to win rounds, will have to leave himself so exposed that Tank Davis is just too blessed of a fighter not to take advantage of those opportunities. I think he's going to hurt Frank Martin at a point. There might be points earlier in the fight where it looks like Frank Martin is having success and we start to wonder, damn, is Frank Martin going to start to pull away on the scorecards here? But I do think that Tank Davis will start nipping that in the bud somewhere like in the 4th through 6th round. We'll start turning that around. And although I'm very tempted to go Tank Davis via decision, because Frank Martin's going to fight a spirited fight and is going to show a lot of resilience and go a competitive 12 rounds where, although Tank gets the win, it elevates Frank Martin's profile and reputation, but I actually think that Tank Davis, I think that I kind of think he's going to get the stoppage here. Now, one thing that I've been wondering is Tank Davis he's been successful for years now, and he's been rich for years. Is he still totally on his P's and Q's after that Ryan Garcia knockout and then his short stint in prison, and just with whatever he's got going on in life, and just again the level of success and for how long he's been successful? Is he as diligent in taking care of himself and with his training to where he will be as sharp for this fight as he has in the past? Again, he's not super young anymore. He's not 25, 27. He's 29 now. And this is the type of skill set and the type of sport where the slightest drop off in preparation and in your physical abilities, like if your reflexes drop just a little bit, it makes a world of difference in the actual fight. If Tank Davis is a slightly reduced version at this stage of his career and he's not at that A++ level, Frank Martin has a chance at winning this one. But if Tank Davis is the same guy that we've seen him in past fights and is still at 100% or near that, Tank Davis should win this fight. And of course, that's unless Frank Martin ends up being better than we could have imagined, which is a possibility. I just don't think that fight against, for instance, Haratunian is evidence of that. I mean, fighters can have their one-off bad fight. It happens. We see all great fighters have those head-scratcher fights like, what was that? And maybe that is that for Frank Martin, or maybe it turns out Haratunian is a lot better than anybody would have given him credit for. But all things considered, Tank Davis should win this fight. And I'm actually going to go with another Tank Davis stoppage. Again, coming into this video, I was going to go Tank Davis via decision, but I'm going to go Tank Davis stopping Frank Martin somewhere in like the 8th through 10th round. And that's largely because, again, we haven't seen Frank Martin really get blasted where he's forced to survive against a super dangerous guy. And that's exactly what Tank Davis is. So yeah, I'm actually going to go Tank Davis via 8th through 10th round stoppage over Frank Martin. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments. Who do you have winning and how? And if Gervonta Davis does beat Frank Martin on this Amazon pay-per-view fight card, which also includes David Benavidez versus Alexander Gvozdyk, if Tank Davis beats Frank Martin, do you think that we finally get a crossover promotional mega fight between Tank Davis and Lomachenko? Or do you think that they're going to keep things on the Top Rank side and keep things on the PBC side and it's that business as usual? What do you think is going to happen with Tank Davis's next fight if he gets past Frank Martin? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.